In international trade, dumping is selling a product below cost. This means that you are making a loss on the product. There are two definitions of dumping. Selling internationally at a lower price than you sell at home. I call that the soft definition. And if you decide you want to charge a lower price internationally, I believe you should find this within your right. If you say that you are still making a profit on what you sell at this lower price, then I would call that price discrimination. I would think that this is a gray area where, since you're actually maximizing profit by price discriminating, it should not technically be illegal. In particular, with regard to agricultural products, sometimes you do have to sell at a lower price because of the perishability of your product. So selling in a second market at a lower price should not technically meet a definition of dumping. So let's move to the second concept, selling below the cost of production. This might happen as part of a strategy because a firm could not sustain such a practice. The strategy, therefore, would be to drive competition out of your market. After a while, you will have to raise your price. But what if another competitor comes in when you raise the price? Clearly, this is a game, and sometimes you are better off not playing the game if individuals will always come in to compete with you when you charge the higher price. There are many cases of dumping, and the organization that polices and serves to arbitrate such cases of dumping is the WTO, the World Trade Organization. Once the accusation is made, the WTO gets involved to arbitrate or to discover whether or not dumping has actually occurred. Prior to 1995, when the WTO was known as the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the rules were not binding the way they are with the WTO, and the penalties for violating the rules of the GATT were not very harsh. The WTO has been empowered to punish countries that do the wrong thing, and this has made the organization economically more efficient. Sometimes the punishment is not so severe, and therefore a country might persist and pay the penalty because of the fact that the penalty is not very harsh. Imagine a scenario where it is worth your while to take the chance to speed, because if you do not get caught, you get a big fat payday, and if you don't speed, you're almost guaranteed not to get any kind of benefit. So it is essentially a cost-benefit analysis whether or not to proceed doing something that the police, in this case the WTO, might object to or rule as being illegal. Countries would continue to do things that were against the rules of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. For example, dumping in the case of agricultural products, selling internationally at lower prices than at home, and certainly than at cost, because the agricultural commodity was already produced and the alternative was to just let the product deteriorate, let it rot. When the GATT was organized in 1947, and subsequently under several different rounds of negotiating up until the 1990s, agriculture was not discussed at the GATT. The term dumping was not applied to agricultural products, which meant that you could continue to sell products below cost, and the word dumping or the concept of dumping was never applied. However, it would be interesting to consider what the dumping would do to the other countries. Let us try to pretend that the concept applied to agricultural commodities, and imagine that poorer countries were better, relatively speaking, at producing agricultural commodities. Clearly, if the richer countries produce a surplus of agricultural products, they would not be purchasing the agricultural products from the countries with the comparative advantage. But again, their surplus would also compete internationally with the other countries who have the competitive advantage. it should be obvious that that surplus is going to push the price even lower, in which case you are intentionally stepping on someone else's toes. You're producing a product you shouldn't be producing, and you're imposing that surplus on their markets and pushing their price down. This perpetual problem in agriculture was due to the fact that prices are determined on spot markets for the most part, and the agricultural production cycle is long enough that the anticipated price at the planning stage of the process can be very different than the selling price on the actual day of the sale. Why did richer countries do this? Well, they wanted to protect their farmers and help their farmers to have more certainty in production. So if there is uncertainty and the farmer is thinking of exiting agriculture, then if you could tell the farmer that you would purchase the product that he did not sell elsewhere, that reduced uncertainty or increased certainty allowed the farmer to proceed with some confidence that farming was not necessarily going to work against him. I would say that there must be a better solution than producing a surplus and dumping it on the international market and pushing the price down. Well, a long time ago, it was determined in economic circles that it might be better to pay the farmer not to produce the surplus. In other words, whatever profit he would have made from producing that surplus, say at a lower price or at a higher price, if you could tell him not to utilize the resources to produce this surplus, then you would give him the profits he would have made, and you're advising him not to produce. You're paying him not to produce, and this would be a better scenario than having him produce a product that either will not sell, or if it does sell, it's selling at a lower price, or selling at a price below cost and competing with the international market and getting other countries angry at you. You pay him to restrain his production and give him the profits that he would have made for doing this. The resources he would have used can then be redirected to another industry, and you're having individuals make better decisions. This is called second best. So this is part of the theory of second best. The best decision is to have the market mechanism work and determine demand and supply and prices. And the second best is if there is already a distortion, then you ask the question, how do you minimize the cost or maximize the net benefit from having this distortion persist? I would like you to think through the mechanism here. The government guarantees you a support price, and it tells you that it will purchase everything you have produced, and then the government will sell what you have produced at whatever the going market price is. So you are being paid a higher price than the government will get when it sells the product. This effectively is what we call a production subsidy. And the taxpayers are paying for this because their tax revenues purchase the product and then have to pick up the slack on the parts of the product that are not sold or the quantities that are not sold. So we are saying that the case of a production subsidy is where we are allowing this dumping to occur. Graphically, we are going to consider production subsidies and export subsidies. We are going to use the same analysis we used with tariffs and show the world market price below the autarky price and the support price either below the autarky price or above the autarky price. These are two different scenarios. In the case where the support price is above the domestic autarky price, we see the possibility that there is some surplus beyond what the consumers want at the support price, and then this surplus can be added to the international market. That increased supply should push the world market price down. If the country is not a significant player in this commodity market, then there will be a negligible reduction in the price. So in the small country case, we would not show any change in the world market price. We would be implying that other countries are not hurt when this surplus is placed on the international market. So our analysis will focus on the revenue that the home country makes from selling to domestic consumers and international consumers, and comparing that to the cost of production to determine what the ultimate outcome of having this industry is. If the producers are receiving the support price because the government is the purchaser of all of their output, then the producer surplus value or the profit will be based on a single price, and it will be the area above the supply curve and under the support price. If we have two different prices, one price for the domestic market and a lower price for the international market, then we are talking of a case of dumping if we recognize that there are two different prices. Assuming that the dumping does not push the world market price down, then there is no reduction in the price for international farmers, but there is a sacrifice of some of the market they had, so they lose on the quantity of sales side, but not on the price side. The analysis is easier mathematically if you assume that the world market price does not change. It should make sense that the export subsidy would be a cheaper policy than the domestic production subsidy when you are actually exporting the product. This would be a case where it is clear that there are two prices, but the government is not necessarily engaged in selling the product internationally. The government might apply the support price, and this support price ultimately turns into a higher price for the domestic consumers to pay to receive this product. That might not even be considered a case of government intervention in the market, because all we're saying is that the government is allowing the firm to price discriminate by charging domestic consumers a higher price than international customers. One thing to keep in mind is that if you have two different prices for the same product, effectively, if you are price discriminating, successful price discrimination requires that the product not be bought at the low price and resold at the high price. So the seller must have a mechanism to prevent the product from being resold so that a third party can capture economic rents by buying low and selling high. In this case then, you want to make sure that your domestic residents do not have access to the product at the international price, so that they will choose to purchase on the international market rather than the domestic market. So let us summarize. Paying the domestic farmer not to produce a surplus, giving him effectively the profit he would have made if he were to produce that, is better for society than allowing him to produce it and then having to figure out how to sell it because of the harm it does to third parties. You can see that the government will save by doing this. The domestic resources do not get allocated into this industry, and we are not paying to do something at home that we don't have to do and then sell it at a cheaper price. Countries should try their best to avoid being accused of dumping, and by paying your farmers not to produce, there will be no opportunity for you to be accused of dumping. You might be accused of protecting your domestic market, crowding out the possibility of increased consumer surplus or net social welfare being greater, but you can see that the subsidy that goes into subsidizing exports will make the society actually worse off. I hope you can determine this on your own, either intuitively or mathematically or graphically. Of course, if the resources cannot be re-employed, we will have unemployment of the resources that would have produced the surplus, and unemployment is another problem that you want to avoid. So people would prefer to get paid to produce a product that will not be used rather than to receive a check for not producing that product. However, it is economically more expedient to pay them to do nothing than to pay them to produce a product that will not actually be demanded. Let us go back to the sugar example. Most Americans have no idea that we pay a higher price domestically for sugar than the international price. Not only do we not know this, we don't care. Ignorance and apathy. A long time ago, I did a calculation that seemed to suggest that the cost per year of the protection of sugar was a $10 extra charge to each customer. $10 over 300 million customers is $3 billion. A better policy would be to look at the profit that the sugar producer would have made out of this $3 billion and just paying him the amount that is equivalent to his profit. So we're paying him the trapezoid that's part of the producer surplus value and not the entire cost of production. Effectively, we're talking about a triangle rather than a rectangle, where the triangle is a part of that rectangle. My assignment to you is for you to try asking someone close to you which of the two policies they would prefer for their government to implement. A tax on foreigners who are trying to sell in our market, an import tariff, or a subsidy to the domestic producer, in the case where the domestic producer will produce the same quantity with the tariff as with the subsidy. My guess will be that most people would say tax the foreigner versus subsidize the domestic producer. The second scenario sounds wrong because we're giving the domestic producer a chance to make more money in what seems to be not a politically palatable way. However, the production subsidy is cheaper for society than the tariff. I need for you to get this. The tariff imposes two distortions, and the production subsidy imposes one distortion. The one distortion from the production subsidy is called a production distortion or a supply distortion, whereas the second distortion on the demand side is a consumption-related distortion or a demand distortion. Please take a look at the social welfare analysis, where we spend time on showing the cost of the tariff versus the cost of the domestic production subsidy.